Hey, good morning, friends. Mr. Flynn here on this beautiful Tuesday morning. It's a little crisp outside, but let's go. So today, in the content section, I have put a PowerPoint for the Milgram Experiment, a very famous Milgram Experiment. So if you haven't opened up the PowerPoint, pause the video right now, go to Content in the Hub, open up the PowerPoint, and follow along with me as I go through the slides. Welcome back. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about the Milgram Experiment today. And from the world of psychology, our course is three disciplines: anthropology, psychology, and sociology. All of those disciplines have their own kind of hallmark kind of cases. So you remember anthropology, and we talked about Lucy. That was the Australopithecus afarensis. I think it was 3.4 million years ago and so on, a female skeleton, a very complete skeleton, and Dr. Johansen we talked about. So that's a very famous hallmark kind of case in anthropology, for an example. Well, in psychology, there are two that are brought up over and over and over, ad infinitum, as they'd say in Latin, or sometimes because they do it too much, ad nauseum. So the Milgram experiment, although very interesting, is referenced many, 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 many times. So I think that the sooner you get sort of this in your head and let it marinate, you're going to see that it pops up. If you go into anything that's psychology related, they're going to use this experiment. And another famous one called the Zimbardo experiment, also known as the Stanford Prison experiment, right? Two very famous cases. Anybody who's taken a psychology course has heard of these things before, okay? So the two names I want you to kind of get into your brain are Milgram, Stanley Milgram here, and then Zimbardo, Philip Zimbardo for the Stanford Prison experiment. So far we've dropped a lot of names on you. So for example, last couple of things, we talked about Sigmund Freud, we talked about Carl Gustav Jung, we also talked about Abraham Maslow, and so on, right? So if you take a look at the curriculum, part of what we're supposed to be doing is exposing you to some of the big thinkers from these disciplines, okay? So today is Stanley Milgram's turn. Okay, so slide one, you can see a picture of the room as it would have been set up for Milgram's experiment. Go ahead and go to slide two. Okay, so this is a diagram. It's a little bit complicated, but see if you can stay with me. Okay, so we have a person, S, and the person S is a theoretical student. And then we have a person, A, let me start over. A is the theoretical student, S is the theoretical teacher, okay? And then E is the experimenter. That's the person who's monitoring the experiment and setting the experiment up. So if you look at the S person, that's the teacher in the scenario, they have a control panel in front of them. And look at the A person, that's your theoretical student. Now, what the participants were told is that this is an experiment to test the association between pain and learning. So the idea is that the student, the person who's in the A chair there, is going to be given word pairs and word association and a bunch of things, and then later on quizzed on those answers, or quizzed on that information. And for every answer that they get wrong, they get an electric shock. So the person who is the teacher, S, has the control panel in front of them, and they can give electric shocks, and you can see there are a number of buttons there, and the shocks can increase in intensity. So the more answers they get wrong, the greater the electrical shock. Now, you have that in your head. Now, I have to flip it all around because it's a bit of a snafu. The experiment has absolutely nothing to do with electrical current, learning, and pain. As a matter of fact, there is no electrical current. There is no pain whatsoever. And the student, the person in the A chair, is actually a paid actor. And the person who is administering the shocks, even though there's no real shocks, that's the subject of the experiment. Okay? And what the experiment is really designed to do is to see how far people will go if an authority figure or somebody they perceive to be an authority figure is telling them to do things, even if those things are morally wrong. Does that kind of make sense? I hope I explained it fairly well. Maybe as I go through the PowerPoint, it'll be a bit more clear, okay? I wish we were in class so I could say, hey, ask me a question. Again, always, if you have any questions, you can pop them an email or I can give you a call, okay? It's no problem. Okay, so go on to the next slide, okay? And you can see that the curtain's being pulled back. I should also tell you, too, that everybody in the experiment is in on the experiment except the person who's in that S chair, the person who's supposed to be the teacher administering the shocks, even though there's no shocks, right? That's the subject of the experiment. That's the only person who doesn't know what's going on. And to make it seem even more realistic, when they were chosen for this experiment, it looked like there were two slips of paper, and one said teacher and one said student or learner, and they pulled randomly so that the person who is going to become the teacher thinks that their role was assigned randomly. In truth, both of the slips of paper say teacher. Whatever one you pick out, you're going to be the teacher, and then the other person's going to just tell a little fib and say, oh, I'm the learner. And then on it goes from there to give it an authenticity. Okay, so, slide number 3 is where I landed. So the Milgram experiment, you can see, and it was conducted at Yale University. So you want to try and associate some of those things. As I said, the Stanford prison experiment is associated with Stanford University, and Yale, this is another famous university, Harvard, all three of which are what they call Ivy League schools, big, important universities / colleges in the United States, okay? They kind of use the word college and university interchangeably. Okay, so what we really wanted to do was try and figure out how the Nazis during the Holocaust could have done what they did. So try and think about Auschwitz, probably the most famous example. And essentially, the guards were responsible for taking human beings, hundreds at a time, and herding them into gas chambers, and then depositing these small pellets called Zyklon B, which sublimate from a solid to a gas. It creates basically a form of cyanide, prussic cyanide, and prussic acid, and it's a form of cyanide, and then somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, depending on humidity and barometric pressure, the people inside are killed. Now, you have to remember that there are women and children going into these gas chambers, and they don't die quietly, right? There would have been screaming and panicking and trying to get out and pounding at the door, and so on. Pretty horrible to envision. But the experiment, what Milgram wanted to do is to try and figure out how ordinary kids, like, farm guys, some of these people were nurses and doctors. Some people were teachers. Some people were engineers. And these people became part of the Nazi war machine and then carried out these horrible orders. So Milgram wanted to try and understand why. What was the relationship between authority and power and then the people who have to carry out the instructions? Okay, so you can see that the experiments began just 3 months after the start of the Nazi war, the trial of the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. So Adolf Eichmann, very famous Nazi. I'll let you read the story on your own, but basically he fled Nazi Germany at the end of the war. He ended up in South America. Israel became a country in 1948. They devised a plan to go over and grab Eichmann. They did. Bit of an operation. That's a pretty good story. You can check out on your own. And then they drugged him, brought him back on a plane, and then brought him to Israel for trial for his crimes. And Eichmann was essentially a paper pusher, a bureaucrat, obviously a horrible person involved in one of the most unspeakable crimes in history. But what was fascinating about Eichmann for a lot of people that studied him was that he wasn't a foaming at the mouth, rabid Nazi. He was a bureaucrat. And unfortunately, he was complicit in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So that's kind of one of the things that sparked this experiment for Stanley Milgram. Okay, so you can see the method of the experiment I've already explained to you. Essentially, you can read this slide on your own, but it's important to understand that the participants were men between the ages of 20 and 50, from all educational backgrounds, ranging from an elementary school dropout to participants with a doctoral degree, so a PhD. That's important because you want a wide range of backgrounds, economic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, as wide as possible in any psychological study. Now, in this case, only men were used in the study. Not true of the Holocaust. There were female guards. As a matter of fact, very famously, there's an almost exclusively women's camp called Ravensbrück, a little bit to the north, and so on. So women were involved in the Holocaust, but for this experiment, he was interested in the military nature of things and the structure of the military. So he stuck with male participants for this one. Okay. So I've already gone over this one as well, but basically the role of the experimenter was played by a very stern biology teacher dressed in a white technician's coat. Now, it's pretty easy to kind of gloss over that detail, but that white kind of doctor's coat, that lab coat that sometimes science teachers wear them, especially in old 80s movies, but that coat, it confers a little bit of an air of authority. And I want you to think about that for a second. We are very sort of used to going along with people in uniform. So if a person tells you what to do, you're very unlikely to do it. But if a person's wearing a police uniform, you're very likely to do what they're telling you to do. It's the uniform that confers the power, okay, and conveys a message to you that you need to obey. How far does that go? That's what Milgram was trying to explore. There are no credentials given to this person. They're just very simply wearing a white lab coat. They're carrying around a clipboard and paper, and they look very officious and so on, and they use scientific kind of terms and stuff. So participants arrived to meet the experimenter as well as another volunteer for the experiment. You can see volunteers in quotation marks because, of course, they are in on the experiment. Volunteer is, in fact, an actor. So the true volunteer and the other volunteer were told by the experimenter, that they would be participating in this experiment to study the effects of punishment on learning. Okay, I'm on to slide number 4 now. The method of the experiment continued. And as I said, there's a slip of paper. One says learner and one says teacher. It looks random, but it's not. It was a fix. And then at this point, the newly appointed teacher and learner were separated. So they have different rooms, and they do not have any contact at that point. So the teacher, or the person who's really the subject of the experiment, doesn't get to ask anything of that learner other than what's in the test, right? So testing right and wrong answers, and doesn't get to see what's happening over much, okay? So they can only communicate verbally, as you can see in the slide. So, but they weren't allowed to talk about anything other than what was in the experiment. Okay, and then you can see on slide number, on slide number 7 now, the teacher was given a sample 45-volt shock. So the person who is the teacher is given a sample of a shock to see what it feels like. Now, Milgram did this. This was the only real shock in the experiment. So the person who was going to be administering the shocks got a sense of what the shocks were going to be like. Now, remember, 45 volts. It's a very low shock. It would give you a little bit of like a pinch. You know what I mean? It would, but it's enough to be uncomfortable for sure. I mean, you wouldn't want to do it as a hobby, that's for sure. The reason was to demonstrate to the teacher the nature of the shock so that the learner would supposedly receive during the experiment each time he gave a wrong answer. Okay, slide number 8 now. And you can see the shock generator that the teacher was told to operate had 30 switches in 15-volt increments, okay, with a voltage ranging from 15 all the way up to 450 volts. Now remember, the shock that he just got was 45 volts, but now he's being told that he's going to be administering 450 volts as an eventuality. Okay, pretty scary stuff. Now remember, there's no electricity being exchanged after this point. All right, so let's see. Again, we've already talked about this. I'm on slide number 9 now. Basically, any wrong answer, you get a shock. So after the learner was separated from the teacher, the learner set up a tape recorder integrated with the electroshock generator, which played pre-recorded sounds for each shock level. So in order to convince the teacher that they were actually administering a shock, there's a sound effect kind of attached to each of the buttons. Okay, pretty simple. And then on slide number 10, and you can see another diagram of the experiment, and I'm going to let you read this. It's pretty text dense, but basically, the teacher was then given a list of word pairs, and he was to teach the word pairs to the learner. So mouse and cheese had to go together. They weren't that easy. Sometimes it would be blue and rock, words that weren't related and those kind of things. Now remember that the student is an actor and is told to give wrong answers at certain times to see if the shocks are going to be administered. So I'm going on to slide number 11 now, and it says at 75 volts, the learner would begin to grunt with pain. So every time he's getting a shock, like that kind of a response. And at 120, he would start to shout that the shocks were becoming very painful. At 150, he would cry out that he had had enough of the experiment, and his protestations would turn to agonized screams at 270 volts. So at 150, the actor, but I mean, it's pretty convincing, is begging to be let out of the experiment. I've had enough, that's it, I don't want to do this anymore. And then at 270 volts is agonized screams. At 300, the learner, or actor, would shout in desperation that he would no longer provide any answers at all. Shock him, or he's just not going to provide answers. And the experimenter, the guy in the white lab coat, he would say, please continue. Just keep going, okay? Even if the learner was silent. Okay, so on to slide number 12 now. At this point, many people indicated their desire to stop the experiment. So the people administering the shocks would often turn to the experimenter, the guy in the white lab coat, and say, I'm not comfortable with this, I want to stop, kind of thing. And then there were several prompts that the experimenter would give to the person giving the shocks, the imaginary shocks. He would say things like, the experiment requires that you continue, right? And it was amazing how many people went along. So right now, as you're listening to me, make a prediction in your head. What percentage of people would go all the way to 450 volts? What do you think? Only 10% of people? 30% of people? 100% of people? What do you think? How many people would actually go through for all of the shocks, knowing that they're causing a lot of pain and maybe even death? Okay, so take a look at the next point here. Most continued after being assured that they would not be held responsible. So as long as they were told, hey, if anything bad happens over there, you're not responsible. They've all signed a waiver. You're legally good. A few subjects began to laugh nervously or exhibit other signs of extreme stress once they heard the screams of pain coming from the learner. Okay, so I'm on slide number 13 now. If at any time the subject indicated his desire to halt the experiment, he was given a succession of verbal prods by the experimenter in this order. And you can see the first one says, please continue. If he offers more resistance, the experiment requires that you continue. If he keeps protesting and I want to get out of here, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And then finally, if he protests again, you have no other choice, you must go on. Now, if at that point, after that last prompt, that fifth prompt, then the person still insisted to be let out of the experiment, they were in fact let out of the experiment and on it went, right? So if the subject wished to stop, okay, I saw that. Okay, so predictions, I've just asked you to make a prediction. So they asked people at Yale, what do you predict the results are going to be? So he polled 14 Yale senior psychology majors as to what the results would be. All respondents believed that only a sadistic few, an average of 1.2%, would be prepared to give the maximum voltage. Milgram also informally polled his colleagues, so he was sitting around having coffee in the staff room and things like this, just asking their opinions, and found that they believed that very few subjects would go beyond a strong shock. Look at the results now. We're on slide 16, right? In Milgram's field of set experiments, 65%, so 26 of the 40 of experimental participants administered the experiment's final 450 volt shock, though many were quite uncomfortable doing so. Some of the people administering shocks had tears coming down their face even as they are administering the shock. There was one individual who was the actor. He commented that he had a heart condition. So after he was no longer giving any verbal responses, we're still shocking him, and many of these people still continued to administer the shock, knowing full well this person had a heart condition. Pretty tough to reconcile human choices and behavior, again, in relation to authority. And you can see there in bold, not one participant out of any of the 40 participants refused to give further shocks before the 300 volt level. Remember, the painful pinch they got as a taste was 45 volts, right? So everybody went to 300, which I think is crazy, but that's people, right? Okay, so, and now ethics, the final slide. So this is slide number 17. So you can see Milgram's experiment raised many questions about the ethics of scientific experimentation because of the extreme emotional stress suffered by the participants. Years later, participants were interviewed, and many of them said that they still felt stress from that experiment. In Milgram's defense, 84% of former participants surveyed later said that they were glad or very glad to have participated because they felt that they were contributing to science. 15% chose neutral answers. And as you can see, many people still looked at the experiment with great concern. So the other thing that kind of comes into this a little bit is a lot of the information that Nazis gathered through experimentation on human beings. Is it ethical to use that information? Okay, just another question just to sort of plant there for you. Okay, so here's your exit card. And if you could, I'd just like you to write 4 or 5 sentences arguing whether or not you think that psychiatrists should be able to perform experiments like this, and I want you to justify your answer. Okay, so yes, because of the gains and what we learn about human psyche and the human condition, or no, it's too traumatic, and I want you to justify your answer and do the best you can. Okay, awesome. I hope you like that. The Stanford Prison Experiment, we may have a movie clip on that rather than me do a PowerPoint. There's a pretty good movie about it and so on. Not too bad anyway. And we'll go from there. Okay, so keep submitting work to the Dropbox. If you need any help or need anything from me, don't be afraid to ask. Okay, thanks everybody. Be well.